Begin tonight with the death of Dolly Parton at the age of 80, one of the most unifying forces in American public life.
For decades, Dolly Parton has carefully protected the most intimate corners of her personal life behind a dazzling shield of rhinestones, humor, and timeless Southern charm. But when a confidential account from inside a private medical suite surfaced, detailing the quiet words she whispered during her most critical health scare, everything the public thought they knew shattered. This wasn't just another celebrity health scare. It was a deeply guarded confession that reframed her entire legacy, her legendary marriage, and the secret promise she made before the world ever knew her name. What did she truly say when the spotlight faded? If you close your eyes and picture Dolly Parton, the image arrives almost instantly. The towering blonde wigs, the sequined gowns that catch every light in the room, that unmistakable laugh that makes you feel like you're sitting on her front porch in the Smoky Mountains, sharing sweet tea and secrets. She is, without question, one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet. And that is precisely the problem. Because when someone spends over 60 years building a persona that radiant, that bulletproof, that universally adored, the world stops asking what might be hiding underneath. We assume we know Dolly. We assume the woman who wrote Jolene and I Will Always Love You has already given us every piece of her heart. But the truth is far more complicated and far more fragile than the rhinestones would ever let you believe. Dolly has always been masterful at deflection. Ask her about her marriage and she'll crack a joke about Carl Dean being a vampire who only comes out at night. Ask her about aging and she'll wink and say she'd never look this good without a little help. Ask her about pain and she'll pivot to a story about her childhood in Sevier County, Tennessee, where poverty was so deep that her family used corn cobs for toilet paper. She wraps every wound in humor so quickly that you forget you even asked the question. But behind closed doors, the reality told a very different story. In the fall of 2023, whispers began circulating through Nashville's tight-knit entertainment community. Sources close to Dolly's inner circle started quietly canceling appearances, rescheduling recording sessions, and tightening security around her private residences. To the public, nothing seemed unusual. Dolly was still posting cheerful updates on social media, still promoting her imagination library, still radiating that signature warmth that makes millions of fans feel personally connected to her. But insiders knew something had shifted. The energy was different. The timeline was accelerating. What the public did not know, what almost nobody outside a very small, very carefully vetted circle knew, was that Dolly had been quietly admitted to a highly specialized private medical facility located outside of Nashville. This was not a hospital in the traditional sense. It was a discreet, luxury care suite designed specifically for high-profile patients who required absolute anonymity. No signage, no public records. Staff members signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements that carried penalties severe enough to end careers overnight. The kind of place where even the janitorial staff underwent background checks that rivaled federal security clearances. Inside that facility, the atmosphere was clinical but hushed, almost reverent. The medical team assigned to Dolly's care had been hand-selected, not just for their expertise, but for their proven ability to maintain silence under extraordinary pressure. Every conversation was monitored. Every chart was encrypted. Every visitor was logged, screened, and escorted through a separate entrance that didn't even appear on the building's architectural blueprints. And yet, despite all of these precautions, despite the layers of protection that money and influence can buy, something happened inside that suite that no one had prepared for. Something that broke through every barrier of protocol and professionalism. One of the attending nurses, a woman who had spent over 15 years caring for some of the most famous names in American entertainment, found herself standing in the doorway of Dolly's private room during a moment she was never supposed to witness. The monitors were steady. The room was quiet. The rest of the medical team had stepped out for a brief shift rotation. And in that narrow window of solitude, the nurse observed something that made her freeze in place. Something so unexpected and so deeply human that it contradicted everything she thought she understood about the woman lying in that bed. It wasn't a medical anomaly. It wasn't a complication on the charts. It was a detail so small, so intimate, and so completely at odds with Dolly Parton's public image that the nurse later admitted she questioned whether she had imagined the entire thing. But she hadn't. And what she saw in that fleeting moment was only the beginning of a confession that would soon spill out in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. The nurse's name has never been publicly released, and for good reason. What she witnessed inside that private suite was the kind of moment that could reshape an entire cultural legacy, and she understood the weight of it the instant it happened. According to accounts that later filtered through trusted industry channels, she had been performing a routine check on Dolly's vitals in the pre-dawn hours, that strange, weightless part of the night when hospitals feel almost suspended in time. The lights were dimmed. The hallway outside was silent. And Dolly, who had been resting under mild sedation, was beginning to stir. At first, the nurse assumed Dolly was simply murmuring in her sleep. Patients often speak in fragments during those in-between moments, half dreams tangled with half memories. But as she stepped closer to adjust the foreline, she realized Dolly's eyes were open. Not fully alert, but open. Aware in a way that sedated patients rarely are. And what came out of her mouth in the next few minutes was not the rambling of a groggy mind. It was clear. It was deliberate. And it was devastating. Dolly reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and grasped the nurse's wrist with surprising strength. She looked directly into her eyes, and in a voice that was barely above a whisper but perfectly articulate, she began to speak. The nurse later described the moment as feeling like she had accidentally walked into a chapel during someone's most private prayer. There was no performance in Dolly's voice, no accent turned up for charm, no sparkle of the entertainer, just a woman, stripped down to her rawest self, saying things she had never said out loud to anyone. The first sentence stopped the nurse cold. "Tell him I kept my promise." That was it. 6 simple words. But the way Dolly said them, with a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and something that sounded almost like grief, carried the weight of decades. The nurse instinctively knew this wasn't a request. It was a confession, a message that had been trapped inside Dolly for so long that even now, in her most vulnerable state, she needed to release it before it consumed her. Then Dolly kept going. She spoke about a life that no one had ever been allowed to see. She spoke about choices she had made when she was young and frightened and desperate to protect the people she loved. She spoke about a sacrifice. The word she used specifically was trade, that had defined every single decision she had made from the moment she stepped off that Greyhound bus in Nashville with nothing but a paper bag full of dreams. And she spoke about someone, not Carl Dean, not any of the public figures the tabloids had speculated about over the years. Someone else entirely. Someone whose name the nurse did not recognize, but whose memory clearly haunted Dolly to her very core. The nurse stood frozen, unsure whether to summon the medical team or simply stay and listen. Every instinct in her professional training told her to alert someone, but every instinct in her heart told her that interrupting this moment would be a betrayal of something sacred. So she stayed. She held Dolly's hand. And she listened as one of the most famous women in the world quietly unburdened herself of secrets she had guarded for over half a century. At one point, Dolly's voice cracked. Tears slipped down the sides of her face and disappeared into the pillow. She whispered a name just once, and then she said something that the nurse would later repeat only to a single trusted confidant. It was a sentence about faith, about waiting, and about the kind of love that survives even when it isn't allowed to exist in the light. The nurse said her hands began to shake as she realized the full implication of what Dolly was telling her. This was not the confession of a dying woman. Dolly was not dying. Her condition, though serious, was stable and treatable. This was something else. This was a soul that had carried a truth for too long, and had finally found a stranger safe enough to hear it. A woman who had spent her entire life singing about love, longing, and heartbreak was finally admitting that every one of those songs had been written for a specific person, and that person had never been the one the world assumed. But the deepest question remained. Who was the whispered confession truly meant for? To understand why those whispered words shook the room to its core, you have to look at the central paradox of Dolly Parton's life, her marriage to Carl Dean. For nearly 60 years, their relationship has been the subject of endless curiosity, tabloid speculation, and late-night punchlines. Carl Dean is the ultimate phantom of country music. Married to Dolly since May 30th, 1966, he has walked a red carpet with her exactly once. He doesn't attend her concerts. He rarely travels with her on tour. He lives a quiet, unbothered life behind the gates of their Brentwood estate, tinkering on tractors and paving asphalt, completely detached from the blinding glow of Hollywood and Nashville. For decades, the public accepted the official narrative. Dolly loved the spotlight. Carl loved his privacy. They were two opposites who made an unconventional marriage work by giving each other infinite space. Dolly herself framed it that way for years, often joking, "They say opposites attract, and we're so opposite we can't even run into each other." It was a brilliant PR shield. But beneath that light-hearted explanation lay an emotional reality far heavier than anyone realized. The nurse's account brought a hidden truth back into sharp focus. Their marriage was not a casual arrangement built on convenience. It was a fiercely negotiated pact, forged in the late 1960s when Dolly's ambition threatened to consume them both. Very early in her career, Dolly and Carl realized that the entertainment machine had an insatiable appetite. It devoured relationships, corrupted identities, and tore apart anyone who didn't build impenetrable walls around what they loved. So they made a decision. Carl would retreat completely into the background to preserve a sanctuary of absolute normalcy, while Dolly would step forward and surrender every visible inch of herself to the public. She would take the hits, the constant scrutiny, the endless tours, and the brutal schedule. But the cost of that agreement was a profound, lingering isolation. Dolly lived two completely separate lives, separated by a psychological wall that very few people could ever navigate. On the road, she was the unstoppable, larger-than-life powerhouse carrying the livelihoods of hundreds of employees on her shoulders. At home, she was a wife trying to reconnect with a quiet world that felt thousands of miles away from the roaring crowds. Maintaining that divide required unimaginable discipline, and it demanded sacrifices that left permanent scars. Perhaps the deepest sacrifice of all was the choice not to have children. While Dolly often spoke warmly of being a surrogate mother to the world through her charity and her countless nieces and nephews, the reality of that decision was tied to intense private grief. In the early 1980s, during a period of extreme physical and emotional exhaustion, Dolly underwent a partial hysterectomy. The medical procedure permanently closed the door on motherhood, plunging her into a deep, agonizing depression that she hid behind bright smile after bright smile on national television. Carl stood by her through that darkness, but the grief remained an invisible passenger in their home. The pact held, but the emotional cost kept compounding year after year. Every tour bus mile, every late-night recording session, and every public appearance pulled Dolly a little further from the quiet life she had traded away. When the nurse heard Dolly speaking in that darkened room, whispering about promises and unpayable debts, the pieces of the 60-year puzzle finally began to align. Dolly wasn't just reflecting on fame. She was reflecting on the staggering price she had paid to protect the people she loved from the very fame she had chased. The glamorous life the world envied had been bought with silence, distance, and a profound personal surrender. Yet as the nurse listened closer, she began to realize that the pain in Dolly's voice went even deeper than her marriage. The confession wasn't just about the sacrifices she had made for Carl, or the family she never had. It traced back to an even darker, buried chapter in Dolly's past. A devastating personal collapse from decades ago that she believed she had survived, but had never truly escaped. What unresolved trauma had Dolly carried inside her heart all these years, waiting for this exact moment to finally surface? To truly grasp what was unraveling in that dimly lit hospital suite, you have to rewind 4 decades, back to the early 1980s. A time when Dolly Parton was universally celebrated as an unstoppable American icon, but was secretly spiraling toward total physical and mental collapse. By 1982, Dolly had done the impossible. She had successfully crossed over from country music royalty to Hollywood superstardom. She starred in blockbuster films like 9 to 5, topped the pop charts, and built a multimedia empire that employed hundreds of people. To the outside world, she was a glittering force of nature, radiating boundless energy and unshakable joy. Behind closed doors, however, the relentless machine she created was quietly killing her. The physical strain was immense. Years of grueling 18-hour workdays, extreme dietary restrictions, and non-stop travel caught up with her all at once. She suffered severe abdominal pain and internal bleeding, eventually leading to a partial hysterectomy that permanently closed the door on ever having biological children. But the physical trauma was only half the battle. The sudden, agonizing hormonal shift, combined with profound emotional isolation and the sudden end of an intense, emotionally consuming relationship, plunged Dolly into a clinical depression so severe that it paralyzed her. Dolly has only spoken publicly about that dark chapter a handful of times, and always in carefully measured, sanitized fragments. But those who were around her during that era knew the terrifying truth. There was an afternoon in the mid-'80s when the woman who gave millions of people hope couldn't find a single reason to keep living. Dolly later admitted that she once sat on the edge of her bedroom, holding a loaded gun in her hands, paralyzed by the overwhelming weight of carrying the world's expectations while feeling completely hollow inside. In her telling, it was only the sudden pitter-patter of her little dog Popeye running into the room that broke her trance, snapping her back into reality. She believed it was a direct message from God, reminding her that she had a purpose left to fulfill, even if it meant carrying her private heartbreak entirely in secret. So Dolly did what she had always done. She packed away the gun. She put on the wig, strapped on the high heels, pasted on that legendary 1,000-watt smile, and stepped back under the stage lights. She buried the darkness so deeply beneath layers of rhinestones and southern charm that the world forgot it had ever existed. She made a quiet, desperate pact with herself back then. She would never let the public see her break. She would be the beacon of light, the joyful maternal figure, the indestructible entertainer who always had an encouraging word for everyone else. Yet trauma doesn't simply vanish because you refuse to look at it. It waits. It lingers in the quiet corners of your mind, biding its time until your defenses are lowered. And inside that private medical facility, under the softening haze of sedation and physical vulnerability, those defenses finally collapsed. The nurse standing at Dolly's bedside wasn't just hearing the fleeting worries of an aging superstar. She was witnessing the sudden resurgence of a 40-year-old emotional wound that had never truly healed. Dolly wasn't just talking about her current illness. She was reaching back through time to that terrified, heartbroken woman from the early '80s. The words she whispered were addressed to the burdens she had shouldered alone for half a century, the grief of the children she never held, the sacrifices she made to stay at the top, and the secret promises she had forged in her darkest moments of despair. The nurse realized she was holding the hand of a living legend who had spent an entire lifetime saving others through her music, while quietly bleeding out inside. It was an extraordinary, profoundly human moment. But in a facility filled with high-profile monitoring and shifting medical shifts, a secret of this magnitude could never stay completely contained within four walls. Within hours of that pre-dawn encounter, whispers of the strange, emotional confession began moving beyond the suite doors, setting off an immediate wave of internal panic among the facility's administrators. What happens when an ironclad non-disclosure agreement collides with a truth too powerful to keep hidden? In the elite world of private, high-security medical suites, discretion isn't just an expectation, it is a legally enforceable condition of employment. Every staff member who walked through those unmarked doors had signed non-disclosure agreements backed by multi-million-dollar penalties and the guaranteed destruction of their medical licenses. The unwritten rule of the facility was simple. You see nothing, you hear nothing, and above all, you remember nothing the moment your shift ends. Yet human nature doesn't come with an off switch, especially when you find yourself standing inches away from the unraveling of a cultural icon. The nurse who sat by Dolly Parton's bedside didn't rush to the tabloids. She didn't pick up the phone to sell a story for a six-figure payout. What she had witnessed wasn't a scandal. It was a deeply sacred, haunting human moment that left her visibly shaken. In the quiet break room just before sunrise, while running a trembling hand through her hair, she confided in a senior charge nurse. She didn't share the intricate details, but she asked a question that immediately set off alarm bells. What do you do when a patient carries a burden so heavy it feels like it's breaking them from the inside out? In a facility that catered to the most powerful names in the country, even a vague, emotional question carries dangerous weight. Within hours, Word traveled up the facility's executive chain. The administrative board panicked. The nightmare scenario for any boutique medical facility isn't a medical complication. It's a privacy breach involving a beloved international treasure. If the public found out that Dolly was hospitalized, let alone that an emotional exchange had taken place behind closed doors, the media circus would descend within minutes. Speculation would run wild, stock prices tied to her brand would fluctuate, and the facility's reputation for ironclad secrecy would be instantly incinerated. By mid-afternoon, Dolly's fiercely protective inner circle had been alerted. Normally, when a celebrity's management team gets wind of an unauthorized conversation or an emotional breakdown in a private setting, the response is swift, aggressive, and litigious. High-powered Nashville attorneys arrive with cease and desist orders. Threats of immediate termination echo down the hallways. Public relations firms prepare aggressive blanket denials, dismissing any rumors as fabricated tabloid gossip designed to exploit a superstar's private life. Everyone in that facility braced for an absolute legal bloodbath. Instead, something unprecedented happened. When Dolly's longtime personal representatives arrived at the suite, there were no screaming matches, no threats of ruinous lawsuits, and no demands to fire the attending staff. Dolly was now fully awake, resting comfortably, and back in command of that gentle, steady composure the world knew so well. When her team quietly addressed the nurse's account, Dolly didn't react with anger, embarrassment, or fear. She simply looked out the window, smiled with a quiet, knowing sorrow, and said something that caught her entire team off guard. Well, maybe it's time it wasn't carried all alone anymore. Her inner circle didn't issue an angry denial because they knew the nurse hadn't fabricated a single word. They recognized the message. They recognized the name she had whispered. And more importantly, they knew this wasn't an isolated, fever-induced delusion. For years, rumors had circulated through Nashville's elite songwriting community about a private, unreleased archive. A literal vault of music, personal audio diaries, and letters that Dolly had spent decades assembling under maximum security. It was known among her closest confidants as the Legacy Project, a treasure trove of art and confessions locked away with strict instructions that it never be opened until after her passing. The whispered words in that hospital room weren't a random slip of the tongue. They were an echo of a recorded confession already sitting locked in steel and concrete, waiting for a day when Dolly would no longer be around to guard it. What was hidden inside that vault? And how did it decode the mysterious promise Dolly believed she had finally kept? To make sense of the words whispered in the shadows of that hospital room, you have to understand a peculiar, legendary object that currently sits sealed at the Dreammore Resort in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. Inside a locked, fireproof chestnutwood box, resting under heavy glass, lies a secret recording that no human ear has ever heard. Dolly Parton recorded it years ago with a single, non-negotiable instruction. The vault cannot be unlocked, and the track cannot be played until the year 2045, when Dolly would have turned 99 years old. Dolly has joked about it in interviews, teasing fans by saying, "It'll probably be played when I'm already gone, and I don't even know if CD players will exist by then." It sounded like another charming, playful publicity stunt. But those close to her creative process knew the recording was something far more somber. It was an unvarnished spiritual testament. And the message she whispered to that nurse wasn't an isolated thought. It was the missing cipher to that locked recording. For decades, the public assumed Dolly's greatest romantic songs and personal confessions were written about broken hearts, legendary affairs, or the silent dynamic of her long marriage to Carl Dean. But when you strip away the layers of showbiz myth, the core of Dolly Parton has never been about romantic melodrama. It has always been about a sacred, terrifying covenant she forged before the world ever knew her name. When Dolly left the poverty of Locust Ridge behind as an 18-year-old girl, she made two distinct promises. The first was to her father, Robert Lee Parton, a hardworking, illiterate sharecropper who carried a deep, quiet shame about his inability to read or write. Dolly promised him that she would build an empire so vast that his sacrifices would never be forgotten. A promise that eventually birthed her global imagination library, mailing hundreds of millions of books to children across the globe. The second promise, however, was far more private. It was made on her knees in a small wooden mountain church, directly to God. Dolly promised that if she was given the gift, the platform, and the endurance to rise above the crushing generational poverty of the Smokies, she would give everything she had back to the world. She promised that she would never hoard her light, never surrender to bitterness, and never let her own personal suffering stop her from being a vessel of joy for millions of lonely, hurting people. She treated her talent not as a career, but as a divine loan, one that required daily, grueling interest. The nurse in that medical suite hadn't stumbled upon a scandalous love triangle or a hidden affair. The him Dolly spoke of in the dark wasn't a secret lover. It was the lifelong covenant she had made with her creator and her father when she was just a penniless girl with a cardboard suitcase. Tell him I kept my promise. It was the sigh of an exhausted soldier who had completed her tour of duty. For over 60 years, Dolly had carried the emotional weight of millions. She had smiled through clinical depression, worked through brutal physical illness, surrendered the chance at biological motherhood, and lived a dual life behind impenetrable walls, all to ensure that the light she promised to project never wavered, not even for a second. The confession was a rare, unguarded moment of a woman asking if she had finally done enough, if the debt was paid, if the trade she made all those decades ago was finally complete. It recontextualized everything. The unreleased song in the Chestnut Vault, the relentless philanthropy, the glitter, and the legendary smile. They were all part of a single, lifelong offering. Yet, as the medical team stepped back into the suite and the morning light began to spill across the room, Dolly added one final, quiet thought, a sentence that shifted the entire meaning of her legacy from a story of quiet sacrifice to one of unforgettable, earth-shattering love. What was the final revelation that left the attending staff in stunned silence? As the early morning sun broke over the Tennessee hills, filtering soft golden light through the blinds of that private suite, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The clinical hum of the monitors felt less cold, less menacing. Dolly's breathing had steadied, her color had returned, and that unmistakable, gentle warmth that has comforted the world for more than half a century filled the quiet space once again. The emergency had passed. The medical crisis had been contained. Within a few hours, the makeup would be reapplied, the signature blonde hair perfectly arranged, and the protective armor of Dolly Parton, the global superstar, would slide effortlessly back into place. To the rest of the world, nothing had happened. There would be no dramatic press conferences, no sorrowful updates, and no frantic headlines. Dolly would return to her public, laughing, singing, and reminding millions why they fell in love with her in the first place. But for the nurse standing beside that bed, the world would never look the same. Because before Dolly fully slipped back into the persona that shields her from the demands of global fame, she looked at the caregiver one last time. Her hand was still resting gently on the nurse's wrist. She looked at the woman who had sat with her in the darkest hour of the night, a total stranger who had suddenly become the guardian of her most sacred secret. There were no tears left in Dolly's eyes, only a profound, crystalline clarity. With a soft, mountain lilt returning to her voice, Dolly whispered the final sentence that tied every piece of her extraordinary life together. I gave them every single piece of my heart, and I never kept a scrap for myself, just like he asked. In that single, devastating sentence, the entire myth of Dolly Parton crystallized into something infinitely more beautiful than fame. For over 6 decades, we thought we were watching a masterclass in country music royalty and show business savvy. We marveled at her sharp wit, her business empire, her flawless songwriting, and her endless supply of optimism. But the nurse in that room discovered what the vault in Pigeon Forge has been guarding all along. Dolly Parton's life was never about celebrity. It was a conscious, lifelong sacrifice. She had made a choice when she was a barefoot child in the Great Smoky Mountains. She chose to turn her own loneliness into a shelter for others. She turned the heartbreak of not having her own children into a mission to mother millions of children through books and education. She turned the painful physical toll of her career into songs that healed broken spirits across every continent. And she kept the love of her life, Carl Dean, tucked safely away in the shadows, absorbing all the public noise herself so that he could live in peace. She had paid the debt in full. Every song was an offering. Every tour was a duty. Every smile was a promise kept. When you look at Dolly Parton today, you aren't just looking at an entertainer who conquered Hollywood and Nashville. You are looking at a woman who carried an invisible cross beneath a cloak of rhinestones, never once complaining about the weight, never once asking for sympathy, and never once letting the world see her stumble. Those whispered words were never meant to be a headline, and they were never intended to spark pity. They were simply the quiet reckoning of an iconic soul who had given the world everything she had to give, leaving nothing behind on the stage, in the studio, or in her heart. The next time you hear the opening chords of "I Will Always Love You," or see that iconic smile beaming from a television screen, remember the woman in the pre-dawn silence of that private room. Remember the sacrifice behind the sparkle. Because behind the legend, beneath the wigs, and far beyond the spotlight, there lives a humble mountain girl who made a quiet promise to love the world unconditionally, and spent every breath of her life keeping it. When the full context of those whispered words is finally brought into the light, it reveals a hidden truth Dolly Parton carried alone for over 50 years. A final message not meant for the headlines, but for the one person she left behind in the shadows.